All right, everyone, welcome back. We're diving into something today that's been causing a lot of chatter lately. China's role in the world. Is it really the unstoppable force everyone says it is? We've got a ton of research to get through and a super interesting lecture, so let's jump right in.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a topic worth exploring. You see headlines about China as this economic superpower, but then you also hear about the potential threat it poses. It's hard to get a clear picture. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And that's why we're looking at this lecture by Professor Michael Beckley at the World Knowledge Forum. He made some really interesting points. Seriously changed how I see things. We've also got this article that talks about how China uses historical events, especially stuff from World War II, to kind of shape its image and influence globally.
Sounds like we're going to get past the surface here and really dig into what China's doing and what it means for all of us. I'm ready.
So let's kick things off with this whole idea of China's economy slowing down. I mean, for years, it's been all China's booming, they're going to overtake the U.S. But Professor Beckley, he's saying that might not be the whole story. He even says China's economy is literally reversing compared to the U.S. What's the deal with that?
Well, Beckley's argument is that a lot of China's growth came from this perfect storm of good conditions that just aren't there anymore. They had tons of cheap resources, a huge workforce because of that one-child policy, and things were pretty stable globally.
So they hit the jackpot for a while, basically.
Yeah.
But now what? Is their luck running out?
Pretty much. Beckley points out how those advantages are now turning into problems. Their resources, they're getting used up. Their workforce is shrinking because their population's getting older, and their government's becoming more authoritarian, which kind of stifles creativity, you know? Not to mention, the whole world is starting to push back against some of their economic practices.
Okay, so the party's over. But this China hangover idea, this is where it gets really interesting. It's not just about China struggling internally.
Right. Beckley says that as China slows down, all those countries that depended on them, they're starting to feel the pain too. China's not buying as much from other countries. They're calling in loans. And they're flooding markets with cheap exports, which undercuts everyone else's economies.
Like that friend who used to always pick up the tab, but now suddenly can't. Everyone's like, wait, I was counting on that.
Exactly. It's a wake-up call for a lot of countries that built their plans around China just keep growing and growing.
And it's not helping China's image globally either. Professor Beckley says this whole economic shift is making people see China in a less favorable light. They're not the golden child anymore.
And this leads to one of Beckley's more unnerving arguments, this peaking powers concept. He says, historically, when powerful nations start to decline, they don't exactly go quietly.
Like that guy at the gym who used to be able to bench press a car, but now struggles with a gallon of milk. He's probably not going to be happy about it.
Pretty much. Beckley brings up historical examples like the U.S. in the late 1800s, Russia at the beginning of the 1900s, and Germany and Japan during the Great Depression. All these nations, they went through decline, and they reacted with aggression, trying to cling to power no matter what.
He even mentions what Russia's been doing recently. And let's be honest, it hasn't exactly been peaceful. It's like, if I'm going down, I'm taking you all with me.
It's a sobering thought, which brings us to the big question. What does this mean for China's future?
Lay it on us. What's their game plan if this decline keeps going?
Professor Beckley highlights three main areas of concern: increasing repression within China, a shift towards using their economy for leverage and control, and a massive military buildup. None of those are exactly comforting.
Okay, break it down for me, starting with the domestic repression thing. That sounds pretty intense.
Well, Beckley argues that as China's economy slows and they lose some of their global influence, the Chinese Communist Party is tightening its grip on power at home. We're talking increased surveillance, censorship crackdowns on anyone who disagrees. He even uses the word fascism to describe what's going on.
Whoa. That's a strong word. But when you put it like that, it does make you think it's like they're battening down the hatches, preparing for a storm.
Exactly. And then there's the economic shift. Instead of cooperating and being part of the global economy, Beckley suggests that China is moving towards a strategy of control and leverage. They're trying to use their economic power to get other countries to do what they want, especially when it comes to technology and resources.
So less win-win and more my way or the highway, not exactly a recipe for making friends.
And finally, there's the military buildup. China's pouring money into its military, modernizing its weapons, and expanding its presence in strategic areas like the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait.
It's like they're saying, if we can't be the world's economic darling anymore, maybe we'll just have to be the toughest kid on the block.
It's a worrying trend, for sure. And it raises a whole bunch of questions about what China's really planning and how the U.S. and its allies will respond.
Professor Beckley talks about China developing these choke points. What are those exactly, and why should we be worried?
He uses that term to describe strategic locations or resources that China's trying to control so they can have leverage over other countries. For example, they're building artificial islands and military bases in the South China Sea, which is super important for global trade. Imagine if they can control those waterways. They could disrupt trade and pressure countries that rely on those routes.
It's like cutting off the oxygen supply. If they control these choke points, they can literally strangle the flow of goods and resources. That's pretty scary.
It is. And Beckley points out that it's not just about physical choke points. They're also targeting key technologies, like semiconductors and rare earth minerals. Those are crucial for making everything from smartphones to electric cars.
So it's a two-pronged attack. Control the physical flow of goods, A&D, the stuff you need to make them. It's like they're playing Monopoly, and they want to own all the best properties.
And here's the problem. If they manage to control those choke points, they'll have a ton of power over other countries. They could dictate terms, impose sanctions, or even use those choke points as bargaining chips in political disputes.
Okay, I'm officially getting a little nervous. This China hangover is starting to feel more like a full-blown migraine. What about their cozying up to other autocratic countries like Russia, North Korea, Iran? Is that part of this choke point strategy too?
Definitely. Beckley says China's forming alliances with those countries to counterbalance the U.S. and its allies. It's like they're forming their own team to challenge the current world order.
So imagine this China controlling key trade routes and resources, teamed up with a bunch of countries that aren't known for playing by the rules. That's a pretty intimidating picture, right?
Yeah. It is. It raises a whole lot of questions about how the U.S. and its allies will react. Can they keep China's ambitions in check? Or are we heading for a new Cold War? These are the kinds of questions that keep world leaders up at night.
Yeah, no kidding. This is giving me a lot to think about. But before we completely spiral into global anxiety, let's switch gears for a second and talk about how China's using history, especially stories about World War II, to shape its image and influence globally. This is where that article comes in. It's based on a book called The Just War, How the Sino-Japanese War Sparked China's New Nationalism. And it argues that China's playing up its role as a victim to gain sympathy and support.
Using history to justify what you're doing today, it's a classic move. It's a powerful way to get people emotional and create a sense of shared identity.
It's like that friend who always brings up that time you spilled juice on their favorite shirt, like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
To guilt you into doing them a favor. Remember that time you ruined my shirt while I need a ride to the airport?
Exactly. And in China's case, they're using the story of past suffering to make themselves look like the rightful heir to a bigger role on the world stage.
Like they're saying, we've been through a lot, so now it's our turn to be in charge. But does that strategy actually work?
Well, the article suggests it's been surprisingly effective, at least within China. It helps unite the Chinese people behind the Communist Party and makes their increasingly authoritarian policies seem okay.
It's like a rallying cry. We've been wronged in the past, but now we're strong, and we'll never let it happen again. But internationally, are other countries buying it?
That's where things get a little tricky. The article says that while this story resonates with some countries, especially those who have their own issues with Western powers, it's not exactly winning over the whole world.
So mixed results. It works well at home, but it's not the magic solution they might have hoped for on the global stage.
Exactly, but it's something to keep in mind. When we're trying to figure out what China's doing and why, they're playing the long game. And they're using everything they've got, including historical narratives, to get what they want.
Okay, so we've got China potentially facing an economic slowdown, showing off its military power, making friends with other autocratic countries, and using history to make itself look good. Sounds like something big is brewing, for sure. But before we dive into what that something big might be, we need to look closer to home. How's all this playing out in China's own backyard with its neighbors? That's where we'll pick up in the next part of this deep dive. Stay tuned. All right, so we've talked about the challenges China's facing internally and how they're getting more assertive globally. But what about their neighbors? How are they reacting to all this? China rising, China slowing down, China maybe not being so friendly anymore. That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah, it definitely matters where you are. For countries that share a border or a sea with China, all these global trends, they're not just some abstract idea. They're happening right on their doorstep.
We found some editorials from news sources in the region, and they paint a pretty clear picture of how China's actions are being perceived by their neighbors. One from the Liberty Times uses this great line: China's ambition is catalyzing collective defense in East Asia. What do you think that means?
Well, it makes sense when you think about the security concerns these countries have, and China's doing stuff in the South China Sea. Their military presence is growing in the Taiwan Strait. They have border disputes with India. All of this is pushing countries like Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and others to team up and strengthen their alliances, especially with the U.S.
It's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right.
I might be accidentally creating a united front against itself.
Exactly. And it's not just about military stuff either. These countries are also working together on economic projects, investing in infrastructure, technology, clean energy. It's about relying less on China and building a stronger regional network.
This is a two-pronged strategy. Boost your own defenses and D, find other economic partners. It's like they're saying, we're not going to let China call all the shots anymore.
Right. And another editorial, this one from a Taiwanese news site, talks about how everyday people in these countries are getting anxious. People are worried about their jobs, their freedoms, even the possibility of war.
It's like when the neighborhood bully starts hanging out on your street.
Yeah.
Things are about to get tense.
Yeah. It creates this feeling of uncertainty that makes it hard for governments to stand up to China. It's a kind of psychological pressure.
So China's actions are having a ripple effect, not just on government policies, but on the lives of ordinary people. It's creating this unease, like everyone's walking on eggshells.
And this brings us back to Professor Beckley's idea about peaking powers. He says that as China's economy slows down and their global ambitions are challenged, they might become even more aggressive, more willing to use force to get what they want.
Like that gym guy who's lost his edge. He's angry, insecure, and looking for someone to take it out on. Not a good combo.
Exactly. And when you combine that with their military buildup, the control of those choke points, and their alliances with other not-so-democratic countries, it creates a really volatile situation.
Okay, so we've got a potentially unstable China, a bunch of nervous neighbors, and a global power dynamic that's changing rapidly. Is there any hope for a peaceful solution here?
Well, Professor Beckley doesn't give any easy answers. He says the best-case scenario is that China's economy keeps slowing down to the point where they have to rethink their aggressive strategy and focus on things at home. But that's a big if.
So we're basically hoping that China chills out and realizes that maybe ruling the world isn't all it's cracked up to be.
Yeah.
But what if that doesn't happen? What are the alternatives?
Well, the other option, and this is where things get really tricky, is that something happens that weakens the U.S.'s position globally. If the U.S. isn't seen as a strong counter to China anymore, it could make China even bolder.
It's like a game of chicken, and we're all just waiting to see who swerves first.
It's a dangerous game for sure, with really high stakes.
Yeah.
But in all this doom and gloom, Professor Beckley does offer a glimmer of hope. He says that even with this Cold War brewing, there could be some unexpected benefits, like a tech race between the U.S. and China that ends up helping everyone.
So maybe some good can come out of this rivalry.
Yeah.
So it's like, if we're going to have a global showdown, at least let's make it about something that could actually improve our lives.
Exactly. Think about the space race. It was all about Cold War competition, but it also led to amazing technological advancements that benefited everyone. Maybe this U.S.-China rivalry, as tense as it is, could also have some positive side effects.
Okay, so a silver lining.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll take it. But let's be real. This whole situation is super complicated, and there are no easy answers.
That's the whole point of a deep dive, right? To go beyond the headlines and really wrestle with these complex issues.
Exactly. And what we've learned from all this research is that the story of China's peaceful rise, it's not as simple as it sounds. Their actions are speaking louder than their words. And those actions are sending a clear message. China wants to change the world order, and they're not afraid to throw their weight around to do it. But the big question is, will they push too far and end up creating a world that's even more unstable and dangerous? So we've covered a ton of ground here. We talked about China's economy slowing down, their military getting bigger, their use of history, and how all this is affecting their neighbors. But here's the million-dollar question. Is China really on its way down? Or are they just going through a bit of a rough patch?
That's the debate, isn't it? Professor Beckley makes a strong argument for China declining, but there are other experts who say they're just having growing pains, that they're still on track to be the top dog,
It's like watching a marathon, right? Maybe they're slowing down a bit in the middle, but they could still have a final burst of energy left in them for that last sprint to the finish line.
Exactly. And there are a few things that could decide whether China stumbles or powers through. One is their ability to innovate. Can they move past just being the world's factory? Can they become a leader in those cutting-edge technologies? like AI robotics, renewable energy.
So it's not enough to just make stuff anymore. They got to invent the stuff that everyone else wants to make. Can they pull that off?
That's the big question. And it's not just about technology either. It's about being innovative politically and socially too. Can they build a system that encourages creativity, critical thinking, people taking initiative? Or will their government getting more and more authoritarian squash all that?
It's like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can throw all the money you want at research and development.
Yeah.
But if you don't have a culture that values new ideas, it's not going to get you anywhere.
Exactly. And then there's a whole population thing. China's population is getting older really fast thanks to that one-child policy. So that means fewer workers and more pressure on things like healthcare and pensions. Can they figure out how to deal with that?
It's like running a marathon with a backpack full of rocks. No matter how strong you are, it's going to slow you down.
And then there's the wild card global politics. Will the U.S. and its allies be able to keep China's ambitions in check? Will they stay united, or will problems at home and disagreements weaken them?
So it's a really complex puzzle with lots of pieces moving around and no easy answers. But as Professor Beckley says, one thing's for sure. China's not going anywhere. They're a major player on the world stage, and what they do will keep shaping the 21st century.
And that's why it's crucial to understand them, their goals, their strategies, what their choices could mean, both for them and for the rest of us.
Absolutely. And whether you think China's on the rise or on the decline or somewhere in between, one thing is clear. This is a story that's going to keep developing in ways that are fascinating and maybe a little scary.
And we'll be here to help you make sense of it all, with insightful analysis, thought-provoking discussions, and maybe even a few laughs along the way.
Speaking of laughs, I think we all need a little break after all that heavy stuff. Our friends over at Mickytolife are back with a new episode. And guess what it's about? Amazing cocktails and travel adventures. It's the perfect way to unwind and forget about all those complicated global issues for a while.
I'm in it. I could definitely use a virtual vacation.
Until next time, keep those brains working, stay curious, and don't forget to have some fun. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into something that'll get you thinking. And who knows, maybe we'll even solve a few of the world's problems along the way.